Boom boom ba doo boo doo. Boom boom ba doo boo. Boom boom ba doo boo doo. Boom boom. Escaping dystopia. Hello everyone. Well, hello no one yet, but hopefully we'll see. Hello people who might watch this later from the beginning. How you doing? Our theme song is boop boop ba doo boo doo boop. Something like that. That's how it goes. Oh, let me get my update. I have a outline. Tonight's show is going to be a little bit different. First off, because it's being done from an iPad, so I guess that's different, right? Excuse me. You know, I don't think hosts are actually supposed to drink the water when they're doing it, but it's not going to be really about that much politics tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of that, but a little bit more of some of the other motivators and whatnot around. Hey, what's up, Henry? Hey, thanks for those messages, by the way. I appreciate that kind of feedback. By the way, I know my conversations online can get a little intense sometimes, and I take it to the folks. Some of this, I'm not going to go too much into it, but yeah, this is, you got to draw a line somewhere. And that's part of what I do, and you have to put your feet down in the dirt sometimes to do that, and then you get a little dirty, but you do have to stand for those things, and I think that's something that needs to happen. So anyway, that's for somebody who just joined us, in case you were wondering. Alright, so first thing, let me go through my quick outline-ish kind of deal, is we're going to talk a little bit about Yemghazi, and then a little bit about our general attitude as a nation. And then something called the Safir-Worf hypothesis, which is very interesting think thingy. Some math stuff, which I teased a long time ago. And then we'll talk about some more. And then a little bit of weird philosophical funny things to note. About the concept of praying to a pantheistic God. Bill Gates on UBI, and something about politics, and a question for next week. So, as per, if anybody has anything to say or wants to just chatter, feel free to join in. Try to be nice during the show. So, I was going to talk. There was the big speech this last week, and I was going to, like I said, this show's not going to be a whole lot of politics or about El Presidente, as he'll probably soon be called, but there's a little bit to cover real quick. There was the big speech, and then the big speech was actually well received. You're going to see a dynamic going forward where this kind of small, low-level provocation goes on with these stupid tweets and this, war with the press kind of thing that keeps everybody all agitated. But when he's on the big stage and everybody's watching, he's going to play real nice. This is part of the rope-a-dope strategy that Bannon is employing over the long term to kind of consolidate credibility. Actually, ultimately, that's what they're trying to consolidate, is credibility. So that's part of what the whole thing with the widow and everything, and that was a touching moment. It's hard not to be moved by stuff like that. You hate to see the kind of politics around it that happen for something that's that big, but for the speech that was huge, and that's all. This is all about that. Again, this is part of Yemghazi, and this is how they try to cut it off and cut off the potential investigations into why did you order this, and wait, that was her? Oh, okay, sorry. We're not going to talk about that anymore. So that was the idea, I think, on some of that stuff. But anyway, I think that's wonderful. I think one of my friends had a tangential connection to that situation, so that moved on, and then the next thing we know, our Attorney General is being investigated by everybody for perjury because of a really straightforward, actually wonderful question by Al Franken. This is how cynical we become. So this was the second thing I wanted to talk about, and this is just this notion that we can have an Attorney General who perjured himself during his Senate testimony, and that is okay. And not only is it okay, it's like, well, everybody lies. And here's a picture of somebody else. And it's like, well, the picture of them doesn't matter because it wasn't that they testified somewhere under oath that this wasn't true. And this is kind of this thing that really kind of bothers me about this cynicism. And this was probably my greatest critique, if you will, of the great and wonderful and powerful Jon Stewart was, I think he played in a little bit too much to this cynicism, and so people can't tell the difference between just utter crap and just, somebody trying to be good that people are talking crap about. Again, thinking this through for a moment. So the idea here is that President Obama ordered phones to be tapped in order to not to win the election, because nothing came out from those tapped phones during the election, but just to make Trump look bad later. I mean, that's insane, and this is a conspiracy theory from a right-wing nut job. I think Mark Levin, if you've heard him, you've probably heard some nasally whiner on the radio, that's him, saying crazy stuff. But now this kind of conspiracy theory, and this takes over. And the other thing you see, and I had a big thread about this with this one guy today, this whataboutism. Well, we can never condemn Trump. Well, what about? This so cynical thing, that's what kind of turned me off this whole week. So, with that, that's all the politics we got for this week. So, just get over the cynicism. Actually, just real quick, I think the president's going to eat himself. This whole thing, this whole blaming it on Obama is not going to work at all, and this is just pushing it to the next level. We'll talk about it next week. But now let's talk about something fun and interesting, shall we? All right. So, for those of you who've seen my show more than once or twice, you've seen me tease this movie Arrival that came out a little while ago, and now it's out on the DVD. I haven't read the book yet. I'm probably going to read it this week. I was going to try and read it this last week, but life happens, keeps happening. It just keeps happening. It doesn't stop. And so I didn't get a chance to read the book yet. I have it on my Kindle, so I'm going to read it. So anyway, it's the book for Arrival. I should have. It's kind of an odd name, so if you want to look it up or read it, you can do it just as fast as I can. And it's not even... Sorry, I was hoping it would pop right up. It's this weird... what's the name of it? Oh, come on, seriously? Oh, there it is. The Story of Your Life. Because the way that the book is written is apparently in various kind of this temporally shifted, both future, past, and present tense. One of the things that this is based on are the concept behind it, and this is what I was reading a little bit about, and this is what we're going to get into, is some of the linguistic concepts. This is called the Safir-Worf hypothesis. This was actually, I remember running into this a long time ago when I was working on my stuff a long time ago, when this kind of started to get a little bigger. And this is, let me read you real quick, the Google synopsis. And this is a theory developed by Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf that states that the structure of a language determines or greatly influences the modes of thought and behavior characteristic of the culture in which it is spoken. What's kind of funny about this, actually, Google synopsis, is these two academics did not actually work together on this theory. They were actually, one worked behind the other, and they never worked on the same stuff at the same time, and each of them had different kinds of conceptual ideas on the degree to which this idea influenced, or actually, there's like a strong version and a weaker version. Some of the stronger stuff, this shows up in kind of some weird sci-fi sometimes, with the notion of certain languages kind of programming people, or that kind of a little bit stronger notion that certain languages have certain people thinking really hard, or this is where you get a little bit of Islam just programs you for evil kind of thing, and a little bit of that kind of stuff. This has largely been supplanted in a lot of linguistic theory stuff by most of Chomsky's stuff, that has to do with most of the structure of languages is pretty straightforward and shows a lot of similarities over time. The one big example that was brought forward for this hypothesis for language was the Eskimo ice theory. This is probably, you've heard of this, that of course, that the Inuit have a great many different words for ice and conceive of snow and ice because of that differently than people who don't live their life surrounded by this, and hence their language and their structure, their language, right, greatly determines and influences modes of thought and behavior, characteristic of the culture for which it is spoken. This is kind of the idea pushed into this movie, Arrival. Now, this was what was fun for me, because this is something that I've been working on for a long time, that in the movie, at some point I have to just assume that people have kind of seen this, and if not, you can watch it, go watch it this week, and then watch the show next week. I'm going to talk about this stuff again next week, a long time. Like I said, this is pretty core to how we will escape dystopia, is change our conception of the world, and this is where this gets into, is you use language to build notions of the world outside of you, and there are certain things about our language and our culture that have become a little cynical, if you will, and inaccurate in their ability to portray reality, that we can really use this to make better decisions. So this is kind of why I'm actually working on this stuff. That's a little bit abstract. But in the movie, there is a communication between human species and an alien species. The heptapods, I believe they are called. Heptaphore 7, they have... they've got 7 instead of 5 digits. And so, as they come through, and I guess I don't want to... How far do I want to go with explaining what I need to explain? Well, what do I need to explain or assume that you know at this point? I'm trying to think a little bit. Because what I want to talk about here is building and talking about a new and slightly different language that humans can use that is a lot like the ones that the aliens used in the movie. They had a language that wasn't built on this linear sound structure of this sentence concept, right? Built this subject, noun, verb, kind of this went there, past tense. But instead, a fully realized circular artistic portrayal, essentially the notion this picture being 1,000 words, and this 1,000 words describing all you would need to know about this situation in order to communicate a thought from one being to another. This is an idea, again, part of the notion of why do we have language in the first place? So what's the point of it? And it's, to communicate this thought. How do we, I've got something going on in here, you have something going on in there. How do we get those two to come together, right? And that's where the language and the notion and concept of language comes in, of course. And so that's what this movie was so fun about, because you take this entirely advanced alien species and then the language that they've developed in order to communicate. And when I saw this movie, it turned out that their language was very similar to something that I've been working on for a long time. It got me really excited. And so I decided to start doing my show. And anyway, so this notion of a single iconic language to communicate and share thoughts and ideas is part of this movie. This is why I've been teasing this for so long. It's out on DVD now, so if you want to go check it out, it'll help you understand some of the stuff we talk about a little bit further on in the show. So, and what I mean by that is this is stuff I've been writing about for a long time. I wrote this whole long book about this. All the politics stuff, we'll go back and I'll tell you how that ties in here in a minute. So, I also did a little teaser a while back, and kind of in my redneck voice, talking about the math that we use kind of as humans currently. And what I mean by that is that our whole concept, and this is again going back to the Safir-Worf hypothesis, or Sapir, sorry. Did I mess that up somewhere? I think I did. Anyway, excuse me. Our concept of numbers and how they work kind of builds our concepts and ideas of how the world works and how things progress normally and ways to understand this. Now, for most of a lot of human civilization, it hasn't really been particularly useful for everyone, or at least most people, to actually understand these wildly advanced kind of things. But now we live in a world where everybody, or at least most people, need to have a concept of things that are a little bit more complex. We're not in the world where, and this is just a little bit of a tangent as far as like who needs to know stuff, but the Trevor Noah book is wonderful. One of the things they talk about in there is the education system, as we're about to see a more bifurcated education system here in the U.S. again, and what they did with a lot of the natives there and how they taught and only would teach basic, simple math and with this sing-song voice and wouldn't teach advanced concepts and ideas. And the thing is, after a certain point when you don't know and learn these things, learning them again after a certain point becomes more difficult, and having to relearn, this notion that yes, Obama did, deport the most number of people, but we've also had the largest country in the world, and if he had just deported at the same ratio of every other president, he would have naturally deported. And understanding these kind of simple math concepts, I think, builds into, we need to have a more educated and just intellectual populace. Part of this builds into, part of what I'm working on is this language to communicate slightly differently. Now, where that comes into base 10, right? So our math system is really, and it builds into a lot of our concept on how things work is built on our base 10, right? We've got 10 fingers, 10 toes. Our number system and a lot of our language system was built to count, I got 10 sheep, I got 5 cows, let's keep track of this. This is where written language came and why humans, needed this as well to communicate these simple, linear kind of concepts. As we've learned more about the world and as science is taken over as our means to gain a greater understanding of this universe that we live in, this simple, base 10 understanding of the way numbers work turns out is not the way so many other things work, the way that populations change, or the way that forces expand, or the way atoms interact. Even this very simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 like thing. 10. What is 10? This is the number of number. This is just our hands. So we use this as a simple concept, as a very core idea. But I think there's a more interesting way to communicate these, and that is where we get to the concept and notion of a base near zero number system. It's awesome. I love it. I do this whole thing, and I'm like, and then I get to punchline and blah, blah, blah. A base zero number system. Now this becomes a little bit weird, because now you're looking at this and you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, all right, so base, and if you've done any programming, or if you're familiar with a lot of computers, you've worked in other bases. You worked outside of base 10. Base 16 is very common in computers, and of course base your binary. You've heard of binary most likely, which is you've got your 1 and you got your 0. You got 2 options. Base 0, you're like, wait a second, 0. How can you do something with 0 like as your only number? And that's not really there. So you actually have 2 numbers to work with. Ultimately, in this number system that I'm talking about, you got your 0, and then you also got infinity. So you've got nothing and everything. And this, I do think, ties back to some of the Safir-Worf thing. As we conceive of a number system that allows us to more effectively understand how the actual universe works, that's not just this number system based on our hands, but a number system and a concept based on what we've actually learned about how the universe works. So instead of building it just from up, we come from up and then come back around to design this. And say, well, how can we better communicate? How can we better talk about this? And how can we do it in such a way that people begin to conceive and think and talk, perhaps, slightly differently, and then ultimately act in a more rational and tuned in to what's actually going on in reality kind of way. And that's where it gets back to some of the other stuff. Sorry. But that's the idea here. So as I don't think people have a really good conception of some of the stuff that happens and why, and that is part of how we can build a better one. And the idea is we become more accepting of the universe we find ourselves in, and rather than continually agitated by a poorly conceived one that's not acting this other way. And I do think this actually comes back to this notion. This is a worldview concept. But it builds into a number system being at the core of it and changing that. And so you have a changing concept of a language and how to communicate. So, that was a little bit about some of what I'm working on, and what a little bit I like to, how can I say this now? This is the basis for this concept, this explaining this. Check that. Give me a moment. So I had I've got my normal outline here, and I wanted to talk about this concept a little bit. So on the one hand, we have the number system, and then the other part I wanted to talk about was language. I'm not going to talk about that this week, though, because I do have to do a little bit more research on that side. So I wanted to talk, one, about our base 10 system that we have, and this base 0 system that I'm talking about. Again, two numbers you got to work with, 0 and infinity. So I'm going to talk next week a little bit more about that model. And I have totally screwed up my thing! See, normally I do a pretty good job of trying to make this flow together. And I didn't do that tonight. Because then it was just going to be jamming this other part in. But I can actually, I guess, go to this. So, as we've talked about, let me see, can I do this? This is going to be a little bit hard, so you guys watching me crash and burn, that's good times. Hold on. If you knew what I was trying to do, I guess you could appreciate the difficulty of it. But part of what I wanted to do, and go back in, I'm a little nervous about this actually, to be honest, because this concept, these tie back in directly. If you'll remember one of my earliest shows, I was talking about the notion of pantheism and the notion of God, and talking about, this is one of the things that I think the political left in the U.S. needs to speak to, this notion. That's part of what I'm doing here, because that's explaining a little bit of that. Where does this moral code come from? Why do I want to stand up to these people and say, you're wrong, this reality that you're fighting for is not the way, this is bad? And this is why it comes down to, is because this understanding of reality, this is that God that I believe in, and this is how I'm trying to communicate that as well. And this notion, this is one of the funny things, this is actually kind of funny, this is what I was actually trying to get to here. And which is an odd point that I was trying to make, but one of the ideas of the Pantheistic God and dealing with it is this it's just so weird to watch people to think of prayer as being the answer to a solution or to a problem. That this quiet contemplation results in an action that you want. And what I have here, it's kind of the idea of talking back to the hum of all creation and expecting it to listen and do what you want. When we have tools to interact with all of it to help make that reality that we want to see come about. We don't have to sit back and have this just quiet, this passive, please help us thing when we have such a great understanding of how the future does unfold and what does make things happen as we learn to. And this is, it's just so much of what is tied up right now in our political issues and our difficulty to resolve them have to do with this inability to move away from this religious reasoning where you can't question some of these notions because there's not a big enough good answer on the other side. And I think there is a bigger and better good answer that doesn't have to rely on these thousands of year-old religions. And one of the people who's talked about it, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's talked about this notion of, everybody being made of star stuff, right? When people understand, when you really get what that means, as you really, so just to think about the time that's involved and the forces that are involved, as far as we understand it right now, in order to have elements that are heavier than helium, you need fusion. And they're created in these huge star factories. And so you start to think about all of this stuff that had to happen in order for it to all come together. And it becomes so big and amazing. And there's so many things to know. But this kind of conception of where we come from and why we're here and what we do is a difficult, it's a little bit more difficult to share because we don't have this fully understanding and this simple explanation for it. And I think we're working towards it, and that's part of, again, my big, long goal here. Again, you can see me be so vague as I try and nail it on the head, but to really get this, I need to feel the inspiration to say the words exactly, and that's because I'm trying to use words. I can draw this in my other language and explain it quite frankly, and we're going to get to that in a few weeks down the road. But this is this speaking to this God and this notion of, in the pantheistic sense, is this the flow of the universe. It's a big and real thing in the world that I live in. Anyway, one to be tried to be understood and generally not to be fucked with. But anyway, got a little wacky on that tonight. So we'll talk about that more as we go forward. Hopefully you can pull something rational out of that. But all of that is what is the word? Informs. I remember when that word started showing up on every show. All of that is what informs all of the politics. And this notion, again, this is where I want to move into one of my last topics. Bill Gates, I don't know, you probably heard of him, he's a billionaire. And apparently, nowadays, you have to be a billionaire, or people have to think you're a billionaire, I guess I should say, in order for anybody to listen to anything that anyone has to say. Because reality is whatever billionaire say it is nowadays. But Bill Gates is actually talking about universal basic income now. Doesn't think we're needed there yet. But it starts to be an idea. And when you start to think of this notion, again, I was talking a little bit of universe size, right? The United States, used to be one of the only countries in the universe that welcomed immigrants. That was inviting a statue. Here, anybody in the universe, come here. There were shows that, remember Men in Black? And the U.S. was like a universal refuge for refugees. And that's changing now. Anyway, that's what informs it. So this is the only place in the universe where we found our kind of life. I think we need to protect it. It's important to useful. We shouldn't treat it like dirt. Anyway. But how do you stop those who want to? There's always, I know actually a couple good answers on that, and we'll get to those. The one thing I wanted to talk about here, and the idea of politics here, and this is my final thing, I do believe, yes? Politics is problem solving, yo. That's the whole idea. You got people who just trying to solve problems. My goal for it, I think, is empowerment for people, right? You want to empower all of these sentient entities, these citizens, to give them the freedom to do that. So it's how do you get there and how do you do that? And that's why the big agreement. But the disagreement that we're having now is not on any of that, but on simply what reality is. So, hence the discussion tonight about what reality is and what we think of it sometimes. And what I want to try and do is come up with better ways for people to communicate that. And so that's one of the big long-term goals. You got me, I told you. Now you know what I'm here for. Ow! Alright, so I can't hide that anymore. So I have to do that. And the big questions for next week. So like I was saying, this whole base zero thing, we're going to talk about this more. If anybody wants to throw up a comment and tell me what the answer to the following question is, you get 12 bonus points. And those who actually I've already talked about this can't answer. But I talked about the base zero number system, right? And so the question then becomes, you've only got two numbers to work with, shall we say, in that base zero system. 0 and infinity. So given those two numbers, what's halfway between them? Can we come up with a third number? We got 2. If we get 3, then we can do something special. So that, should you choose to accept it, is your challenge for next week. Come up with the answer of what's halfway between 0 and infinity. Halfway, perfectly halfway. And we'll talk about that next week, as well as a little bit about Kiki and Booba, who are my little language experts. They're so fun. But that's about all we have for the show tonight. So I'd like to thank anybody who did stick around for it, and those who did not. Change it up a little bit, which is always fun for me. If a little disjointed and strange, I'll work on the flow. I gotta work on the flow. It's all about that flow. So anyway, y'all have a wonderful night, and thanks for tuning in. Peace out, and the way to get out of dystopia is that way. I guess. Alright, peace out.